Governor Cheryl, District Governor Cheryl has decided that her project, something that she's very passionate about, is human trafficking. And so they have appointed a district task force, to work on this project. And Karlee has been busily going all over the district, zooming all over Alaska, talking to people about this effort. So without further ado, Karlee, you're on.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to your Rotary Club for having me here today. I really appreciate the welcome. And as President Michelle said, the District Governor Cheryl, she did ask me to put together a subcommittee. And so I have been working on that for the last couple months now. And she wanted me to basically put together this subcommittee to start looking at what is trafficking, let's raise awareness, and let's start going forward in our state to do what we can to stop human trafficking. And so part of what I have done is put together a presentation that talks about what is trafficking. It's just a presentation for those who aren't as familiar with it. In the work I've done over the last year or last couple of months with Rotary, I've come across people who know a lot about it, and then other people who are just not familiar with it. And so this presentation will give you a little bit of an introduction to what it is. And then I also want to talk about the subcommittee and maybe recruit some people to be on it. So just a little pitch there, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started with the presentation. Can everybody see that okay?
No.
No? Okay. Oh, let's see here. Okay. Okay. All right. Here we go. All right. Can everybody see that now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So what District Governor Cheryl asked me to do was basically a twofold approach. And this, just to be clear, is probably going to be several year approach. As I understand it, the future district governors are also very much on board with human trafficking awareness and trying to fight this in our state. So Cheryl's first approach was raise awareness, go to all of the clubs that you can, explain what trafficking is, share with them how it affects our state. And then the second piece of it was we need to create a database of resources of who in Alaska does what entities exist that fight human trafficking, where are the gaps, what do we need to fill in. And so that's what I've been doing that piece of it. And so what I've found is there's a lot of people in Alaska that are fighting trafficking. There's a lot of entities that are working towards putting an end to trafficking in Alaska. Unfortunately, at this time, we do still have a lot of gaps. And what it sounds like different entities are trying to do is figure out what those gaps are so that we can fill in the gaps and make sure that we're targeting all of the areas that we need. Just an example, one of those issues is we do a lot of raising awareness and training, but when victims are taken out of trafficking, we don't necessarily have a place for them to go. So that's an example of some of the gaps we're finding, but I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. So just as an introduction to trafficking, I want to address, just a second, there we go. I wanted to basically look at these few questions. What is trafficking? Who's at risk for it? Where does it take place? And what happens if you see it, what do you do about it? And then also what is being done right now in our state and abroad to be able to stop human trafficking? So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, this was issued several years ago, about 2 decades ago. There's been a lot of additions to it and changes through Congress, but by and large, this is the definition of sex trafficking that I want to look at and that I want to make sure people are aware of. Sex trafficking, it's a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, and coercion. When we're looking at individuals under the age of 18, that force, fraud, and coercion piece goes away. And then when we're looking at other forms of trafficking, as you can see there, it's the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services. Again, that terminology, force, fraud, or coercion, is used again because that's what we're really wanting to make sure. If people are being forced to do something, coerced, or they're doing something by fraud, such as being made a promise, here's money if you do X, Y, Z, and then they never receive that money. Those are the pieces that Congress has said, this is what we're looking at. This is what trafficking is. Now, specifically when it comes to the different types of trafficking, labor trafficking usually involves violence, threats, lies, things like debt bondage. There was a study recently done, and in 2018, there were 148 goods from 76 countries that Congress found had been coming into the United States through child labor and forced labor of individuals. So that's an example of what forced trafficking labor looks like, or excuse me, labor trafficking looks like. And then as sex trafficking goes, that is just a whole nother ballgame. But with sex trafficking, by and large, seems to be the biggest one that I have found here in Alaska, as we're trafficking individuals for commercial sex purposes. It doesn't mean that labor trafficking isn't occurring. It just means that we're finding there's a lot of sexual trafficking going on in our state. So who is at risk for human trafficking? Anyone can be trafficked. It doesn't matter background necessarily. Anyone can be trafficked. However, traffickers are going to exploit people who are very, very vulnerable. As you can see, the list of people there, I mean, it's in our state particularly, while all of these could definitely be true: trauma, neglect, family breakdown, homelessness, those sorts of things. In our state, we find that our Alaska Native community is very heavily trafficked. I've done a little bit of work meeting with various entities in Anchorage. One of them is Alaska Native Justice Center. They're an organization that does a lot of legal work for individuals as well as social type work, helping them get into services. They are a community, or excuse me, they are an organization that, while they do focus on the Native community in Alaska, they are not specific to Native Alaskans. They will work with anybody. But in meeting with them, what I found is that trafficking among the Native population is very, very big. One, we have a lot of, rural Alaska. We have villages spread out all across our state where we don't really know what's happening. And so it's easy for people to be trafficked in those villages, or they're taken into Anchorage with promises of a job or promises of something, and then they're trafficked once they get to Anchorage. And another issue that I learned is that when it comes to younger women, and by women, teenagers are often trafficking their own children due to issues of substance abuse. My former job is I worked as an attorney for the Office of Public Advocacy. I represented children and parents that were caught up in issues with state custody with OCS. And what I found is a lot of minor victims, or excuse me, minor clients that I had, they were very heavily subject to trafficking. They would run away, they would age out of the foster care system. If they went to jail and then they were released, they had nowhere to go. So younger folks like that don't have a connection to family are very highly trafficked as well. But when we're looking at who is at risk, and we hear that it happens all around us, but yet we're not seeing it, be on the lookout for people who are a little more vulnerable than the average person. Now, where does human trafficking take place? It can take place anywhere. It doesn't matter where it's at. It can take place in any village, in any major city, in any minor city. It can take place anywhere that people exist. However, there are specific areas where it's a little bit more likely to be taking place. Areas like conflict zones, when you think of war, people are being displaced, they're refugees, they're going from a place that's not their home. In our state, again, what we find is that in the rural areas, there's a lot of trafficking going on. And that trafficking might not exist fully at the village or somewhere that's hard to get to by boat, except by boat or plane, but those individuals will be taken back to Anchorage oftentimes. What I've found in my own research is that human trafficking will start in, a rural village somewhere in Alaska, and that person may need some medical care. And so they'll come to Anchorage, not really being aware of, quote, the big city and what takes place in it. And then they come to Anchorage, and then because they're already vulnerable or impoverished or young or what have you, they're very easy to spot, and they can be picked up for trafficking that way. The other issue that I found that's specific to our state when I've talked with places like Covenant Home, for those of you who are familiar with Covenant Home, it is an organization here in Anchorage where, you know, homeless youth or runaway youth can go to and they can have shelter. What I've found in speaking with Covenant Home is that Alaska is a little unique in that oftentimes we're not just picking people up off the streets for trafficking. A lot of it is done online. For example, you know, it's too cold outside in January to be going outside. It's not like we live in Florida and you can just go outside and be walking the streets of the beach and find somebody or find vulnerable people. Here in Alaska, we have to do a lot online. And traffickers will stalk people in chat rooms. You can use things like Snapchat and use various tools online to be recruiting individuals into trafficking without those individuals knowing. I attended a conference a couple years ago through Priceless. It's another organization in Anchorage. And they were telling stories of how, you know, Alaska is very transient. So we have young folks that move up here with their parents from the lower 48. They're not familiar with anybody. They don't know people. And so they get into a chat room. A trafficker notices that they're new to the area, starts befriending them, trying to find a meeting place with them. They exchange pictures with each other that are inappropriate pictures. And then all of a sudden, when that girl that has met some boy that she thinks is a nice guy online comes to find out that at some point in time, he's really just been building this relationship with her over months because he's about to traffic her, and she doesn't know that. And so that's something that Covenant House confirmed to me that happens a lot in our state, is we have to be careful of what trafficking looks like online. Now, all of these other examples that I gave here, they happen too. And it's not that they don't happen in Alaska. We deal with those issues here in Alaska, but by and large, it's villages and on the online presence where trafficking is really taking place. So how would I recognize it and what would I do if I see it? These are several examples of what does trafficking actually look like. When you see somebody that doesn't appear to be able to speak on their own behalf, that could be a sign of trafficking. They don't have control over their finances. They don't have identification documents. When they don't seem to have their own autonomy, that can be a clue that something is not right. Now, that doesn't mean that if you see any one of these things that they're automatically being trafficked. It just means that accumulation of these things could be a sign of trafficking. There is an organization in Anchorage called Alaska Institute for Justice. They're basically a law firm, but they work with individuals that either have been trafficked or are much more vulnerable to trafficking. When I met with Alaska Institute for Justice, what they advised me is that they're seeing more labor trafficking coming into the state. It used to be, from their perspective, it had been sex trafficking, and it still is. But what they're seeing is individuals come to Alaska with the promise of a fishing job or something out in rural Alaska where they can make a lot of money. And so they come to Alaska from another country or the lower 48, particularly when it's another country. Then we have immigration issues where their traffickers take all of their documentation, their passport, their any other form of identification they have. And then they also they control their housing. And so what this individual, the president of, the executive director of this organization, Anchorage, said that they're finding that more and more people are coming to Alaska with the promises of these jobs, but then when they get here, they are completely controlled in their housing. So they can't go anywhere. They can't control where they live, who they live with. And that's been one of the signs that they've noticed when a trafficker has taken a victim, they have a loss of autonomy. So be looking for things like that, geographically confused. A lot of traffickers are shuttling people through airports. And I don't know how many of you have been able to travel lately. I know with COVID, it can be pretty difficult, but we're starting to see more and more signs in airports that give indications of trafficking because traffickers are taking their victims through airports, but those victims won't have their ID, or they won't be allowed to talk, or they won't be allowed to go to the bathroom on their own. So these are more things to start recognizing. And it can be challenging, but the issue is if you see something, say something. There's a national human trafficking hotline. I've written all of the information off of the side. And this is a number that anybody can call. If you suspect something or you see something or you're not sure, just call these numbers or call this number or text, because this organization is set up to be able to help identify victims, to be able to put those victims into, to be able to reach law enforcement. And if even if we're not sure, I've come across instances where even when I'm not sure, it's a good idea to just call anyways, because when you tip somebody off, it at least puts law enforcement on notice of something that could be happening. And so what is being done to stop human trafficking? Well, right now, I've noticed in Alaska, a lot of it is public awareness. We're raising a lot of education. A lot of people just don't really know what human trafficking is, or they've heard of it and they think it happens maybe in other countries or in poor countries or in a really, really big city. And we're starting to learn that that's not the case. It happens everywhere and it can happen to anybody. Here in our state, we have had several task forces set up. It's a issue of funding. It's an issue of what our state legislature will allow or won't allow. I do know that right now, very recently, Governor Dunleavy is looking to restart a task force that existed several years ago, and to rebuild that task force to start looking at these very things that are written on this page. What can we do for more awareness? What can we do to make changes in our states? What does this look like for Alaska specifically in comparison to other places like the lower 48? So I don't believe that that's fully underway, but it is something that he is wanting to start up again. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with an organization called My House. They are specific to Wasilla, Alaska. So if you're not familiar with them, that is okay. But it's two Rotarians do run it. And it's an organization that helps homeless youth. And they're very, very heavily involved in trafficking issues here in the Mat-Su Valley. And so so we've been working with them, we being the Susitna Rotary where I'm from, we've worked with them a little bit to find avenues for our youth to get taken out, to have resources. So one of the things that My House has done has set up a safety home. They're in the process of putting together a home for individuals who are coming out of trafficking. And that home would be a place for those victims to go to have shelter, to have meals, but also to be rehabilitated. As you can imagine, the devastation of being trafficked would be huge, and they would need a lot of counseling and other medical resources at their disposal. And so that's something that My House has been working on. However, statewide, it's not something that our state really has set up. Across the country, there's many states, there's probably 20 or so states that specifically have resources set up for victims of trafficking, so that when we've stopped human trafficking, we know how to continue to prevent it, or excuse me, to continue keeping it at bay. We can continue keeping those people in a safe place. But Alaska doesn't really have anything like that set up yet. We don't have any laws on the books that say, this is how we're going to treat victims when they come out of trafficking. This is what we're going to do to rehabilitate and help them. And so that's something that definitely needs to be done in our state, but we're starting to recognize it. And so we're starting to recognize that that's the next step to try to stop human trafficking, is developing policies and making systematic changes, not just doing things in an isolated city. And as far as shelters and safe homes go, anybody who is interested in that sort of work should understand that it can be dangerous. It can be a difficult place to be in. But again, human trafficking is a dangerous business. But we need more people to be involved in it. And shelters and safe home is probably one of the biggest areas in Alaska where we do need more help with that. This is, so there's a gentleman, his name is Tony Regzin. He is an Alaska State Trooper. He resides out of the Mat-Su Valley. However, he works statewide as he is a trooper. I recently brought him into the Susitna Rotary to speak. He is in the crime, he does undercover operatives, and he works in the Mat-Su Valley. He has done a lot of work in Anchorage. I mean, his sole purpose is to disrupt traffickers and to take victims out of trafficking. But when he spoke to our Susitna Rotary last week, I asked him if I could give his contact information at these presentations that I do, and he was absolutely willing to do that. So anybody that wanted to write this information down could do so. But he says he gets calls all the time. day or night when when somebody notices something suspicious or sees people that it just doesn't look right. He said, use my number, call me, because he is overseeing trafficking in Alaska. And so this is just another resource that you could refer people to. The one thing is that if you see somebody that's trafficked, don't go up to them, don't approach them, don't approach their traffickers, but call people that can help. The hotline, our local law enforcement, those are people that can help. So now I want to talk about the human trafficking subcommittee. Right now, we have a few people that are involved in it. We've had a lot of interest, and right now we're trying to figure out, what does the committee look like? What does it look like going forward? So for this year, we're establishing a committee. We're doing these club trainings across the state. There is a co-chair. Her name is Dawn Weiss. She was formerly in the Wasilla Noon Club, and now she's in the Susitna Club as well. And she and I are putting together presentations. We're wanting to go across the state and speak to each of our clubs. And for this year, it's really more of a grassroots effort. And DG Cheryl was very aware that this would be a slow process moving forward for the committee. But at the same time, we're looking at, what does this look like for 5 years down the road, or however long our district governors want to continue looking at trafficking. So for this year, what I'm trying to do is establish the committee and establish what I'm calling just area leaders, as our district is divided into 5 regions. If there's interest from anybody in any individual region that wants to take on some work for trafficking, the one thing that I am really needing is, what are your resources in your community? So in Ketchikan, what resources are available for anybody who's been trafficked? And it doesn't have to be just a trafficking organization per se, but it can be just a homeless shelter, a soup kitchen, a homeless shelter for youth. It doesn't have to be something specifically focused on trafficking, because a lot of times what we find out is these soup kitchens all of a sudden have, people coming in off the streets that have been trafficked or are vulnerable to being trafficked. Homeless shelters, they're very vulnerable for being trafficked. So what I'm looking for is, in each of our regions across Alaska, what do we have that is set up to maybe help victims of sexual assault, because that can turn into trafficking, or just victims of abuse that can also turn into trafficking. And so anybody that has an interest in looking at your own community and figuring out what is taking place in your own community, that ultimately goes towards District Governor Cheryl's goal of, let's create a resource so we know where are all the places in Alaska. So if somebody in Ketchikan comes to you, or you see something suspicious, you would know maybe where those people should go, or how to help them, or what law enforcement agencies to call. The law enforcement agencies would know where to send these victims. So those are things we're looking for as we go on down through the rest of, years 2, 3, and 4. And as we go further, we want to ultimately be able to have this database set up, have people that are working in each of their 5 areas of Alaska, creating more resources for victims, safe houses. We want to start looking at areas of fundraising. What can we do to actually raise not only awareness, but fundraising efforts for what victims might need, what different entities might need. So it's a pretty long-term approach, as you can see. Right now, we're just starting out, but anybody who's interested in being on the subcommittee, anybody who's interested in maybe heading up in your own area resources that might be engaged in trafficking awareness, I would love to have your help. We have about 5 or 6 people that are really committed to the subcommittee, but anybody else that wants to get on board, we're happy to have anybody and everybody that is interested. The one great thing about Rotary is we all come from different backgrounds. We all have different skill sets, and every sector of society is affected by trafficking. And so your knowledge could be very helpful in creating resources or tools that our state specifically needs. Does anybody have any questions? Let's see here. I can't tell if anybody.
I can't tell either. Yeah, we've got a question here.
Sure.
And yeah, you should come up here.
Okay.
So my question has to do with Rotary as a general organization. How are we addressing a lot of the issues? Because a lot of the statistics show that sex trafficking is fed in a large part by both the porn industry and the prostitution industry. And are we addressing that on a Rotary level, beyond the local level, on especially messaging? Like, I don't know if you watch like movies, TV, but there's a normalization of these things, which actually feed into incredibly dangerous behaviors like sex trafficking.
So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking what is Rotary doing to focus on more of the local areas as opposed to what the federal enforcement would be doing? Is that what your question is specifically?
I was actually more is does Rotary have any broad like things approaching like explaining how these kind of feed in? You know,
honestly, at this point, not really. When I asked Cheryl what we've done or what we're doing going forward, she said right now, her understanding was that Rotary has not, our Rotary in Alaska, I should be clear, Rotary in Alaska, there is not a lot that has been set up to look at trafficking, whether it's local, statewide, really much of anything. Now, I know Rotaries across the country and across the world, there's a lot of organizations that look at all facets of trafficking. There's a lot of Rotaries that do that across the country, but for Alaska specifically right now, unfortunately, there's not a lot of awareness of what trafficking is in our state and how it affects us and what we're doing to prevent it. So to answer your question, not really. And that was part of District Governor Cheryl's request was, this is a huge passion to her. It's a huge passion to me. And why aren't we as a state really focused more on stopping this? I mean, it's everywhere, it's all around us, but we don't really know what it looks like. And if we do, what do we do about it? So no, not yet. And that's why she put together this subcommittee, as we can start as a group of, skilled people. What can we do to start making actual change in our state?
You got another question here walking up. Go ahead, Jillian.
So,
What?
Haley, hi, it's
Hi.
Jillian Moon.
Oh, hey, Jillian.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
So one of the questions is, well, it's not really a question, it's a statement. I want to be on the subcommittee for sure. That's
Okay,
absolutely
great.
something. And I've actually met and worked with some freed sex traffickers
Okay.
up in our area. And one of the things that I realize as in my profession is that though they might come from the street, sometimes they're presented in a very nurturing manner. Their captors bring them to the clinics for checkups constantly, and they're well dressed, but they never, there was a church in Anchorage that was actually participating in this. So it went on for a long time, and this one of my friends her daughter was born into it as well in that situation. So one of the things is like when they can't go, they'll drop them off at events and stuff like that, but nobody else can pick them up and bring them home. So sometimes it's very, very subtle and sometimes not as obvious as you would think. So I have a great passion for this. So I'm really excited about it.
Well, thank you so much, Jillian. And yeah, it can be really subtle, and that's that list of things to look for. Not any one of them is necessarily the linchpin that makes you know it's trafficking, and all of them could be present, and it could be very, very difficult to know. And I think that's why when so many people say, how is it happening all around us, I don't see, is because it can be subtle. But Jillian, I'm excited that you wanted to be on board, so thanks for coming up, and yeah, we'll get in touch after this is over.
So I've got a quick comment, and hopefully I'm not putting him on the spot, but I have a member of our club, Ty Walker, who's actually a member of the Ketchikan Police Department. And I was wondering, Ty, if you might just say a few quick words as to maybe some observations from here in Ketchikan, if there have been any. He might have stepped away from his computer. I don't know. Oh, there he goes.
No, our legislature could certainly add some laws to help us prosecute those. I can't think of any real cases in Ketchikan in the recent past that are kind of like this. We did have, Jack Duckworth brings a lot of kids into our town. they're troubled kids. I know that there's people that have traded sex for drugs, which would kind of fit into this. It's a problem. And we could use some laws to try and prosecute those kind of cases, though.
Mhm.
Thanks, Ty.
Sure.
Moving back online. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious. I don't know if Diane Gubatail is in person there, but Wish, I wonder if Wish had any experience, maybe some of the other people might know, with people coming into the community and ending up in Wish. Normally, I think it's domestic violence sufferers that end up in the Wish facility, but it'd also be very appropriate for people that are in this situation we've been talking about.
And what is Wish? Is that a entity down in Ketchikan then?
Yeah, Wish is
Okay.
our Women in Safe Homes
Oh, okay,
shelter.
okay.
And it's very active. It's growing. It's one of the community things that is very helpful for people in a very difficult situation.
Mhm.
And Diane Gubatail, one of our members, has been very active in that. In fact, our project this year is to provide a playground for children that are at Wish.
Oh, right.
I'm looking. Any more questions from in the room? Okay, I'm not seeing any. How about the folks online? Pat's I see you scanning, Pat. Karlee, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
That's great that you and Jillian have that connection from Rotary up in Wasilla in that area. And hopefully, Jillian, you guys keep in touch, and that'll be your Ketchikan connection on your subcommittee.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. And if anybody wants this presentation, I'm happy to send it to President Michelle and you can distribute it if you want it. But thank you so much for having me. I hope you've been able to learn a lot, and I look forward to seeing what the subcommittee is able to do as we fight trafficking.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Good
Thank
job. All righty. Well, thanks, guys. How was the order off the menu breakfast? Good. All right. Awesome. Have a great rest of your week. And remember, next week we are here. Next week it'll be extremely